So if you were paying attention in my last video, I made a mention about macros and how I was going to build a couple of macros to help with my Daisy Hill Data Mart, and we'd be talking about those in the future. So the future is now. So I thought we would take a shot at looking at building your first macro and trying to understand what a macro is and can do for you. If you haven't been to Alteryx's help page, they have on here a nice little summarization of macros, talks a little bit about different types of macros that you can build and how you can use them. There is a class in the Alteryx community's education platform that'll walk you through building macros. There's a lot of posts and blogs about macros, and you can follow through on those to figure out how exactly they can work. Also keep in mind you might get a little bit confused between macros and analytic apps. Macros and apps use some of the same features and functionality, but an app is interactive and it will ask you questions during the running or before the running of your workflow, and then utilize the answers that you give it at the beginning for carrying out the rest of the workflow. I vacillate between talking about apps before macros or whether to talk about macros before apps. And it really doesn't matter which way you begin. The learning curve seems to be the same. I myself tended to avoid macros and apps when I started working with Alteryx, figuring out I could just sort of ram through and hard code everything along the way. I then started building a couple of apps and saw some of the power in apps. Then I delved into macros in order to make more powerful workflows in general. Discovered along the way that because of the interface capabilities and the customization capabilities provided within an app or a macro, you can do a lot more with your workflows than you can do by running them from scratch. So talking about where to begin and how to learn about macros, well, the easiest way to begin is to start with a small simple problem and then figure it out, and slowly over time learn how macros work and expand out what you will do with your macros and how they can help you do more and more sophisticated kind of work. It really comes down to trial and error. You will need to try to build your macro, see how it can work, learn how all the pieces fit together. Look at some of the blog posts both on the Alteryx website as well as might be out there in the rest of the world, and slowly you'll become more comfortable with building macros. So let's look at a very simple macro, and that's it talks about in here what you can do with macros. The basic version of a macro is designed to replace a repeating piece of code. One thing that you can do is if you're having a kind of standardization in a calculation that you wish to apply to multiple workflows, you can put that in a macro so that the calculation is done the same each time. But we're going to do two different things with our macro. One, macros. We're actually going to create two macros during this video. We're going to try to make our overall processing of our data into our data mart a little bit easier. And one macro is going to be a little bit easier than the other. The one we start with is going to be pretty basics, gives you the feeling for how to go. And then the second macro is going to be a little bit more sophisticated, and you'll begin to see how macros fit together and what you can do with them and what you can't do with them. So let's look at our Puppy Data Mart that we built through this first workflow. This is in my collection on my Yoo-hoo. Yeah. So this is the process by which we built the first couple of tables in our Daisy Hill Puppy Data Mart. If you are subscribed to my channel and watch some of the earlier videos, we walk through how we built this and put it out there for you to see what it could do in order to create these two tables. But along the way, I recognized that we're doing some things the hard way that macros could help us. So we're going to look at what this workflow is telling us that can be simplified, and macros can help us with that. So first off, something that I would be doing in all the tables that go into my data mart is the date time now, which becomes the batch timestamp. This is done pretty standardly. It basically starts with date time, selects it and turns into a date, gives it a name, and then later in the workflow goes ahead and appends it to our workflow. It's very easy to cut and paste this out and put into each of our workflows. You might need it in a couple of places in any workflow, but after a while you begin to say that, wow, I wish there's an easy way of doing this. So one of the easy ways that macros can be built is to go ahead and simply add data into your work stream, so that all that you would need to do would be to call your macro and go on from there. So again, the three pieces that we need in here are the date time now input, the select widget, and then the append. So if we go ahead and highlight those and copy them out, that's how we're going to start this macro development. Again, when you're working with macros, it's great to have a working piece of code that you need in order to turn it into a macro. So we'll copy that. We'll create a new piece of code. We'll paste those three in. There we have them. So these three pieces is the core of our macro. Again, your macro needs to be able to be executed for testing purposes, as well as once you've done it within a local test run, it then makes it easier for you to go ahead and to build it as a macro and connect it in. So what we need here obviously is we need some input coming into our append function, and of course we'll need some output coming out of it. This is the piece that's here for coding. So what we want to do here is go into our interface. This is where you have the macro and app specific widgets. Since we need input flowing into this macro, we will start with macro input. And if we connect it here, that becomes our flow. But you notice that at least one field must be selected. What this needs, and trying to tell you with this error message, is that you need to give it a basis or a template so it understands what it's going to be doing, so that then you can interface to it. So what we want to do here is simply edit it. And in editing, we'll want to give it a single column. We'll call it just for lack of anything better to call it. We'll give it a value of 1. That just becomes a value. Right-click on the white space, we see that it's happy with using that as my template. So now this workflow looks pretty good as far as errors are concerned. So all I want to do now, this basic workflow, is, again, I'm going to need to stream this data out. We'll do that with a macro output. Dragging that onto there. That simply returns data back to whence we started. We can test this very quickly by running it. And you can see that what comes out of this output at the end is my column it that I created as a template and my batch timestamp. Things look good, but I need to plug in the rest of my real data into this, and this is where it becomes more powerful. So we'll want to go ahead and save this macro so we can build it into a new workflow. Click on File, Save As, Browse. You notice it came to a macro subdirectory. This macro subdirectory I defined so that I can find my macros very easily. If you can see, I've already have my batch timestamp here, but we're going to call this batch timestamp YouTube. So it differentiates from the one that I've already created. I can now save this, and now I have created a macro that would appear to work. Obviously, I need to test it. As a quick aside, showing you where we define this is in Options, User Settings, Editing User Settings, Macros. I can give it multiple directories of macros, and this is in order. We can set one as a default, but this is the order by which it will search for the macros. So I can do some pretty good organization of macros once they start to get a little carried away, but at this point in time I don't mind having just one directory. So when I look for a macro, it will look in here. When I save a macro, by default this is where it will go as well. So now I have this little macro that appends data onto my workflow. Let's go ahead and test this. So let's go ahead and pick a small piece of data just for our testing purposes. One thing that I've done a lot of is go ahead and with text input, you can create some dummy data. You can also cut and paste data in here. You can use something else that you have. But just to get a reasonable piece of data, showing this a little bit more in real time, I can go into my MySQL database. Let's go ahead and refresh this. I'm pretty sure I have a simple dimension. I think we have breed dimension. Some reason it switched over, but this will be my Daisy Hill. Well, let's just go ahead and see how this looks here. Let's pick the breed dimension. Don't like the way that looks because it assumes the default definitions. One reason why I like to type in names myself. But knowing that, I can come back into here and edit this. Notice the select statement is the actual name of the table, but I can tack Daisy Hill schema on the beginning of that. Test it. Everything looks good. Do an OK. I can do a run because we're not going to do a whole lot with this. And you can see that this dimension does not have a batch timestamp on it because it was never processed by batch but manually loaded by our users. But it's a great place just to test this out. So what I want is this data to flow into my macro. Right click on my white space. I can click on Insert. Way down the bottom is Macros. I can browse for a macro, or it also knows that I have one open right here in my workspace. I can click on that. That becomes my macro. I need to go ahead and format this macro or just connect the macro through configuration to my input data. So let's go ahead and use our width coming in as a numeric field. That's why I chose that. So this is just a way to connect up my data flow in. If you've noticed some of your selects, just pull a select down here at the back just very quickly. We want to use this anyway. You know this unknown is in here. This unknown should never be deleted. You should just leave it alone. But this is how this macro can know to process any data that flows through it as well, because Alteryx can handle unknown fields that are defined after your workflow is first built. Let's go ahead and run this very quickly. Well, let's put a browse on the end as well. Not that there's much to it. And run this. So you can see here that we went ahead and executed it. And our data happens to have, again, the name it. So what you will see is that the macro changed the field name coming in to that default one we had created previously, gave it the breed name that was already in this table, and then appended the batch timestamp on it as well. So we can go ahead and we'll need then to remember the change the name of this field. But since I use with a whole lot, it makes sense to come back to my macro just to make it so it'll in most cases not affect me. Edit this data. Up here I'll put with. Also, if you notice over here, we're going to pop back again. It's going to give us it's solid blue here. It's nice to have a pretty picture here. I tend to put my little coffee man in this. So let's do that fix as well. Over here in Interface Designer, if you haven't already attached Interface Designer, you can do that over Views. Interface Designer is one of the views I always turn on when I first start a new version of Alteryx on a machine. And then I actually get it so it's unpinned, and it lives then on the left since I have unpinned it. If we pin it, oops, we got rid of the overall configuration. Let's pin that one, Interface Designer. Let's pin Interface Designer. There we go. So now, here's my Interface Designer. For my macro, you can see that here is the choose field. Some configurations that I can do. One is to change the icon. Let's go ahead and browse. Choose my little coffee man. And that way, when I go ahead and save this with the changes that I have, again, unpinning that so you can see it's over here on the left. I can click on it and modify it. And when I go off it goes away. Save space. Let's go ahead and save this guy. Doesn't appear here, but I go to my new workflow. It tells me that it's been updated. Do I want to refresh? Answer is yes. So therefore, my coffee icon came up. When I run this, oh, we need to re-edit it since we changed its definition. There we go. Now coming out of it, we still have width, but it's only width because my macro called it width. If I wasn't using width coming in, and that's simply there for a placeholder in order to get the flow of data going into my macro. It's always a good idea to check coming out, make sure information is coming out the same way you expect it to. That's what the select for is after the macro. You're never sure exactly what the macro is going to be doing if you don't have access to it. The last thing we want to do is in our configuration, click on runtime. One of the options we have is to show all macro messages. If you notice that when we ran this originally, we couldn't see what happened in here. So let's go ahead and run it now with our messaging turned on. So we can see that batch time slab U2 went ahead and it had 12 records generated input into output. Gives you an idea of what's going on just in general. So here is our data stream. So what will happen with this macro is anywhere I need to get a timestamp into my stream, I can go ahead and just simply plug in this macro, make sure I clean up anything after the macro, but essentially I have my input flow and then I have my output flow that includes the batch timestamp. So this gives me a great test use case. What I can then do is go back to my other workflows, modify them to use this as well. This is a pretty simple macro, so let's talk about something a little bit more sophisticated. The second macro that we want to build today, again, is quite simple as well because I'm just replacing existing flow with a generic flow. So the second piece that we want to look at is here where I do my dimension lookups. Remember that if it is null, we want to call it none and give it the 0 value. If it does not match after we do our join, we want to go ahead and give it a value of -1, which is our unknown value. Seems pretty simple, but if you notice in this workflow we did it twice. We also had another workflow where we skipped having to do it 3 times and built something based upon our earlier work, but we still had to do it one more time. So we continue to repeat this dimension lookup whenever we do a fact table. So it'd be nice if this dimension lookup was automated in a fashion or just simply able to include in it something new to build with. So let's go ahead and talk about how we would do that. So let's start a new workflow. Let's go ahead and bring in just our puppy data as our sample that we'll be using the test with, just to get an idea of what we would be doing. Got our puppy table as an example. Test our query. Got that spelt right. And in that puppy table, remember we had our breed dimension. Let's bring that second input in just so we can understand how this is working. Connect to the MySQL database. And this would be the breed dimension. So that's our basic two pieces of data that we'll be looking at. Let's go ahead and run this. And you see this is where we want to do the lookups between the two. And we don't want to have to repeat that, but we want a macro to go ahead and match the breed name to the breed dimension. To do that, obviously, let's create a new macro that we'll be working with. And remember, we need to start with input flows. In this case, we need two flows of info coming in. And just to expedite the creation of this, I am going to paste it from an already saved copy. Because again, I may have these two pieces of input, but I need to give it some basic data. And in this case, it's also going to be some reasonable test data. So here what I have is a record coming in, and this will be my input flow, which happens to be calling it name as a generic name, and I give it a value of 1 just for testing purposes. I then created another template of flow data in. This happens to be my ID. Learning from before, let's go ahead and call this width. Actually, there's a reason to call this. This is going to be match ID. Continue to improve things. 1 is a 1. Again, use that as name so we can match it up. So that is our data that we will be using to build this macro, but not actually to execute the final version of it. So what do we want to do? Well, we had the issue. Let's go ahead and just for the fun of it, add 2 more rows of data to this test so we can see what it looks like. We have a null value. And let's go ahead and also have an unknown of 2. So give us the full flavor of the actual run of the workflow when we get ready to use it. So as we talked about, what we want to do is that if the input is null, in this case empty because it's a string, we want to give it a value of none. So we use our formula widget. If name is empty of name, give it a value of none. Otherwise, let it keep its current name. Again, this becomes runnable and it will run it off of the template's worth of data. So as you're putting it together, we can ignore that little error message just for now. If we want to correct that, we can change the data type coming into here, but we don't need to worry about it going through. To do our match, because we're dealing with this in a more simplistic method, we can use our find and replace. I'll forget to go ahead and change this to be now to think about it, making this more general. It's fun developing on the fly. Let's go ahead and take care of making sure that if someone passes us something bad in, we can deal with it as well. So notice that our data type coming in here is a string of 3. Let's go ahead and make this a varchar of 25 just to cover our bases. I think it should be good. So again, we do a replace. Modifying this says that entire field name is found within name. I'll go ahead and make a case insensitive, and what I want to do is to append match width into our data string. So running this now, we see we have our ones and our nulls. The last thing we want to do is that after this replace, if there's a null, we want to set it to the unknown width, which is a -1. So we go ahead and we'll add a formula on there to handle that as well. Letting my drag and drop get in my way. So in this case, match width, conditional, if match width is null, the value of -1, otherwise give a value that it held, which is match width. Now running this through, again we have the same issue coming in with this data string. That should not be that won't be a problem when I run this, but again, to cover all bases, rather than this be a byte, because again it's matching it up. Let's set that integer 32. Looks like what we wanted it to do just within our test data. So we have our macro input. We need our macro output so that we can run it. We attach our macro output onto the end of it. We want to save this so that we can utilize it easier within our workflows. Nice how Windows likes to change things on me. We're going to do this as dimension. Just notice I already have a dimension lookout created because I was working on this. So we go ahead and just simply change that to dimension lookup. YouTube. From our interface designer, what I was looking at there was just the overall questions it's going to be asking me. I was happy with those. So now I have a macro. Let's take a look at, we want to bring these two pieces of data together in that lookup. So simply now we want to insert our macro dimension lookup. You notice that this widget now has 2 inputs, 1 and 2, so we drag those in. Interesting, it did not pick my macro. Remember to save it. There we go. So we had the latest one. So we need to map these. So clicking on this, input field name of string. We want to use the kennel name. actually the breed name, matching with breed name, so it matches those up. If you Again, I just gave some pretty terse names in here. Giving it better names might go ahead and allow us to understand entering it better, but pretty confident that these will work for me. I need to put a select on the end here. You notice it says match with, so it's going to come out of the macro. We want that to be breed with, and then put a browse onto the end of it. So now when we run this, it'll query my two data sets, pass them into the macro. The macro will go through and give me my, you notice it renamed the breed with the breed name to just name. But we have breed with coming out. So this is where actually in this workflow as I go through here, I would want to turn this off. Move this up as we went through the process. So now my data comes out pretty cleanly. And what I would want to do now is if I wanted to match up the kennel name, I would simply put that macro in here, bring in my kennel dimension, and continue to add however I want to rationalize the dimensions. But this becomes a simple single icon to drop in here rather than the group of 4 that are embedded inside of my macro. Show you what this looks like when I get done with it all. If you remember our puppy costume fact, I went ahead and used these 2 macros in the construction. So here's where I did my lookup my costume. And then I added my timestamp as well. Makes the workflow a bit easier to develop. Also makes it a little bit more straightforward and clean to look at. And it saves me having to code that lookup and the timestamp every time I want to use it in any of my workflows. So this is a look at the very basic methodology for building a macro. It doesn't do any customization. It just simply allows me to do repetition. Stay tuned to this channel and I will be building a macro that does some customizations and allows me to do a little bit more flexibility in utilizing the macro and in writing my workflows.